Teams, we're all part of them. They're in every domain of our life, and I'm sure we can all think of multiple examples of teams we've enjoyed being a part of and those we'd rather forget. But is there a magic formula to building successful teams? What does it take to inspire and lead those teams? Our guest today has been designing impactful culture and people strategies for over 2 decades, building and leading teams in multiple industries, regions, and across all levels of hierarchy. So I'm delighted to introduce Beat Calabretti to learn how to build successful teams. Welcome to In Good Company, Beat. It's nice to see you. How are you today?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm doing fine indeed. Thank you.
Good. Well, as with all of our episodes, we like to give our guests have the opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit more. So the way we do that is we ask to tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Excellent. So, who am I? I'm Beat Calabretti. I'm 52 years old. I'm a global HR executive with, as you said, 2 years of experience with a deep expertise in talent, people, and organizational development. I've been working over the globe in different industries, 10 plus years in the life science sector with Roche, Syngenta, Celgene, and Siemens Healthineers, and another 10 plus years in the hospitality and FMCG industry with Accor, the TUI Group, and the Barry Callebaut, where I am since January of this year. My role is the VP of Talent, People Development and Culture, and I'm leading the recruitment, learning, OD, and talent teams. I'm living in Switzerland, close by Basel, with my wife and 2 adult children. So that will be me.
Awesome. What a perfectly well-articulated introduction. So thank you for that. And I was very excited to hear when we set up the interview for today that you are working for one of the world's leading chocolate organizations. And so, do you get like a lifetime supply of free chocolate now? Is that how that works?
Indeed, a direct pipeline into the kitchen. Absolutely. No, but,
what a dream. What a dream. Well, let's move on to our sort of first main question, which is about the topic of today's podcast, which is all about building and inspiring successful teams. So when you're faced with a particular challenge of supporting a leadership team to work together more effectively, where do you tend to start? What does a high performing team need to be successful, and how have you kind of led this process in the past?
I think for me, I think there are five key elements which come to my mind. The first one really being that the leader in the organization needs to be really, really clear on the vision, the reason for being, the purpose, and then the strategy on how to achieve the objectives. And I think it is absolutely critical that the leaders can articulate and cascade strategy to all levels of the organization, to be clear on the from to scenario, the start, step, continue, but also to be clear on accountability and how they would like to measure success moving forward. So that will be the first one. The second one is really around ways of working. And it sounds a little bit technical, but I think it's key to really be clear on the governance, the RACI, so who is actually responsible, accountable, needs to be consulted, needs to be informed, and then to agree on the ways of working. And it's a simple thing like meeting structure, the commitments, etc. So that will be potentially 2 hard facts, which I think are really, really the base. But then a good communication is an absolute success factor. Leaders being able to inform, provide feedback, good and critical ones, being able to coach the employees and create a culture of psychological safety where, people feel really, really are able to challenge and to support each other. I think that's absolutely critical. And then it's all about managing the performance and the contribution of the team whilst building the capabilities as well necessary to achieve the objectives. And that entails a learning culture, right? It's about learning, unlearning, engaging in change, letting go all of it, going to the change curve, responding to it in an open way with a growth mindset, and then really encouraging knowledge sharing, democratizing information for the whole team. That will be for me, the recipe, or at least a good attempt to create high performing team environments.
It was a nice acknowledgement to the company that you now work for with the recipe. I like what you said there. Yeah, there's some really cool things there. I like what you said about all around clarity of vision and purpose and ways of working, good communication, psychological safety, and developing that kind of learning culture. And that you can, I like also what you said about unlearning there. I think that's a really key part of that. So that's really cool. And I wanted to ask, you mentioned at the beginning there, you worked in multiple industries, from pharmaceuticals to agribusiness, hospitality to retail. And you, as we've spoken about, you currently work at Barry Callebaut, which, as we've already kind of talked about, is one of the leading manufacturers of chocolate, high quality chocolate and cocoa products. You've had a quite a breadth of sector experience. So I'm curious to see, or curious to kind of learn if you've seen commonalities of approach for team working across that kind of diverse sectors, or do they all require kind of their own different focus?
Well, that's a good question. Let me just think a little bit. I think, generally, I would say the principles of high performing teams do apply to all industries, right? I think at the end, we're all humans. We all have the same needs for inclusion and sense of belonging and being part of a team. And I think that can be achieved with the criteria as I just elaborated on. I think the differentiating factor is really the nature of the business. The maturity and readiness of the organization to engage with the topic, right? So I think readiness, maturity's ability of leaders is the differentiating factor. So it is absolutely critical to understand what is the business model, what are the customer needs, how are we going after it, what are the different enablers. So the context in which you operate really determines the approach and how you go after it.
Yeah, absolutely. That context is kind of critical, really, and that kind of tying in both those things with those five elements that you mentioned earlier, I think is a really good way of kind of approaching that. So, moving on to kind of my next question then, which is, we know that building a good culture and working environment is something that's front of mind for executive committees, and yet, I suppose, since the pandemic, many organizations have an increased number of hybrid teams. First of all, have you seen that yourself with your experience, and how, with a lot of teams being hybrid nowadays, how do you still build that learning culture in that hybrid world?
Yeah. Well, I think it has become reality, right? So I think I have teams. I'm now 10 months into the organization. I haven't met all the people personally. So I think, the hybrid working model has become reality. It's accepted, but we have learned a lot on what to do differently. If you ask me about, how to really instill a learning culture, I think there are two things which need to be addressed very systematically. And one is the learning ecosystem. And what I mean by that, again, is to really understand, the governance, right? How is learning organized? What's the learning architecture? How are we supporting learning with technology? How is AI enabling us to democratize learning to the whole world, right? Where in our case, we have, people in the factories, we have people in the offices. So there are different learning preferences, different learning styles. So that's super important that we address that and we plan for this diversity. And in order to achieve that, I think the collaboration between the HR learning and development organization and the different business, the business learning function is absolutely key. So we really ensure that we do collaborate hand in hand, and that we understand, where we can leverage resources, where we can scale resources together, that we define different go-to-market strategies as well in learning. So that's pretty important, and that we really provide also consistent processes, tools, and technology, which is guaranteeing a great learner experience moving forward. And that we support that by the necessary standards, policies, and guidelines, and analytics to provide data to continuously evolve the ecosystem. So that will be, from an organizational point of view, what I think is absolutely key to emphasize. If we then think about culture, so the culture needs to be lifted from the top, right? So the C-suite needs to support and sponsor and recognize learning as one of the core values, and as a key innovation factor, retention factor, talent attraction factor for the talents which we have. That obviously needs them to be supported by the guidelines, by ensuring the leaders in the organization are spearheading the policies as well, and that we are installing learning champions across the world, which then can engage in communities of practice, so that we can ensure that our learning resources and approaches are highly relevant, and support people in their jobs. Yeah.
I was really interested to what you said there about the culture element of that kind of learning, and that needs to be led from the top was what you said, and I guess a supplementary question on that would be, like, if you find yourself in an organization where it's not being led from the top, do you think there's a way of kind of influencing that change to kind of to help that culture? If you see a need for it and you're maybe not at the top of the chain, do you think there's a way of encouraging that kind of change in culture? Do you think there's anything there?
Yeah, I guess it is. We have always different instruments to drive this learning culture, and it is all starts with a clear expectation towards all leaders. So to really ingrain that into our values, leadership behaviors, and how we measure our leaders as well, right? And how we reward our leaders. I think that will be certainly how I would support that moving forward.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. Yeah. And another question I had around that's kind of based on the hybrid nature of working is that obviously with that, and it's always been a thing that we've had cross-cultural teams, but I think it's even more that we see a lot more cross-cultural teams with the fact that we are so much more connected than we ever were before. So I kind of want to get your insight on that, really. What has been your experience with working with cross-cultural teams, and how have you overcome any challenges that you might have experienced by working with those teams?
Yeah. Well, I think I will go to the principles I set for high performing teams. So I think there will certainly be one aspect which need to be considered in working with cross cultural teams. But I think it's really important to really harness the best communication tools and insights you can get to understand your team. And obviously there are different instruments which you can use, such as the insights, the MBTIs, working changes, etc. So in essence, really to ensure that we provide different lenses so that people can connect, and then to understand the team diversity and the background of the people, right? Because everybody is coming from a different perspective, has a different construction of reality, has her or his intentions and different maturities. So the ability to engage with those different people is certainly absolutely important. And I think also how you work with people, right? To be really mindful about this diversity as you're engaging them either physically or virtually, and to plan for a good, equal communication with the people where you are mindful on what you would like to achieve. Either it's an approach where you want to take decisions, or where you want to have creativity, and where you will really actively involve all the people to contribute. I think that's something which I think it's key that leaders live up to that, and in order to monitor it, I think it's also quite helpful to regularly test team health and the engagement of the team, to understand, potential blind spots and then opportunities to address moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few bits to pick up on there. I think you're absolutely right. That communication piece, with all of the members that would be in that team, and creating that space for learning about people's cultures, no matter where they find themselves in the world. I think that's not only important to find out more about the individual as a person, but also to find out how they work differently to how you work differently. I think that's a really key aspect, and it all goes back to what you said before about that learning culture, and also creating that sense of psychological safety, isn't it? Because it means that people can openly share of, oh, well, that's not how we would have necessarily done that, but this is how we might do. And yeah, I think that's it's only going to sort of take you from strength to strength, that having that clear, a sort of agreed approach on it, on how you would do that. So I wanted to move into a little question a bit more about you, which is the as you've worked in so many different sectors and countries, and what strategies do you use yourself to stay adaptable and open to change as both the business landscape and leadership expectations kind of evolve?
Well, first of all, to remain humble, right? I think to accept that, there's a learning opportunity every day. So to be really open, be curious, listen to understand the perspective of people, and not to confirm your own theory, which you have accumulated over the years. I think expertise can be a gift and a curse at the same time. So remain open, learn about the business, and most importantly about the customer needs, right? But that's for me the baseline, and then build a solid strategy and a plan, and co-create that with the business. I think that's for me one of the key aspects. HR and the COEs are sometimes in danger of creating those ivory tower solutions. I mean, we need to ensure that what we provide, what we build, is highly relevant to the business, is an enabler for the strategy, an enabler for the necessary capabilities moving forward. And then, really understand the stakeholder needs. And it starts from the shareholders to the ELD, to the shop floor, to really understand the different intention, needs, etc., bring them together, and align them behind the strategy. I think that's potentially one of the biggest opportunities for COEs in general, in order to create this very solid end-to-end solution which can be sustained over time. I think that's critical. Something as well where I personally always need to guard against it, which comes a little bit, against my nature, is don't strive always for the perfect solution. An 80% prototype is good enough. Learn fast, be agile, adapt to the changing environment, prototype, and manage the resources very carefully, right? Invest in solid working relationships, and manage your own energy as well. I think that would be a few ideas which come to my mind to your question.
And with your career history, was there a particular pivotal moment of where you learned from an experience that you can think of that made you maybe change your approach? I mean, you mentioned about, well, all of the things that you just mentioned there. Was there a point there where where was there a sort of a previous life where you didn't, maybe you always strive for that kind of 100%, or was there a point where you went, oh no, 80% is fine? What made where did these learning experiences come from, do you think?
Well, I think the pace of the business has accelerated over the last few years, right? When I started a good 20 plus years ago, you know, I think we're always dynamic, but the last few years have accelerated the business. So
Mm.
there are different factors influencing it, influencing your work. So you need to be very alert about those things, right? So it's more, I think, a continuous evolution over the last few years, which encouraged me to think more in a more agile way of doing things, whilst protecting solid practices. Right? I think it's a balance to strike. It's not that you're reacting to every need in the organization, but you need to understand where to be flexible and where to adapt as the business are evolving. Would put it this way: it's being firm on your overall strategy, but being really responsive and agile to adapt as new insights emerge.
Yeah, I think that calculated agility,
Yeah,
I think, is a crucial piece at the moment.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I suppose it always has been, but it seems even more so now. And talking kind of about learning experiences, you've actually worked with Impact on a number of projects over the years, and so I kind of know that you're familiar with our approach of experiential learning. And I'm not necessarily asking you to talk about your direct experience of Impact, but experiential learning as our methodology. How does that work with you, and how you operate within your business, in your kind of your line of work? What does it work better than classroom learning? How does it resonate with you?
Well, look. My philosophy to learning really is that learning is a direct enabler of strategy, right? And therefore, it needs to be hyper relevant. It needs to be applicable immediately back at work, and that requires us to think in a blended learning approach in general, where we enable on-the-job learning, where we enable learning with and from others, where we have formal learning,
Mm.
and that's the recipe, right? You can call it the 80-20-10 approach, 70-20-10 approach, or however. But I think that's important, right? I think and people have a choice today, right? We have technology, we have
Yeah.
5 generations of the workplace. My children learn very different than I. They're 30 years younger than I. So we need to accept that this is a need, and with AI coming in
Mm.
and technology coming in, we can create those blended learning, these experiential learning solutions for the business. And the impact has been great since many years to enable that through classroom learning, in-market journeys, etc. So yeah, so I think this has a place, and that is really where what we need to strive for. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting what you said there about the um, technology is always going to be a part of our lives now, for sure. There's some fundamentals of human to human interaction and an experience there. I think that's a nice part of what you've put there, is that no matter where technology is, there'll always be a sort of a human element, and human connection element. And and again, you also mentioned about how we learn as a certain generation versus the younger generation that are coming in and learning in totally new ways. it's still kind of based on experience in some way, shape or form, isn't it? It's and I think that's, for me, how that's a really crucial part of how we approach learning is all, you say that you become a better driver after you've learned to, after you pass your driving test, and so it's because you gain that experience afterwards. So yeah, I think that there's some really, really kind of key points that you've picked up on there. So thank you for that. It feels like this conversation has gone extremely quickly because we've reached our last question already. Which is a sort of a bit more of a personal question, I guess, which is to kind of ask you, and we ask all our guests the same question, which is, if you were to start your career again, all the way back to the beginning, starting your career again, what is the best piece of advice that you would give your younger self?
Well, be courageous, stay humble, learn, respect people, and search for feedback. So I think that would be something which I would really encourage. And to my younger self, I would recommend to do more of what I just said, right? So I think
Sure.
In the younger years, you're really passionate, driven, etc. So listening well to people, co-creating work, build true partnerships, right? These are the things which I think are critical. And stay curious, stay really curious.
Yeah.
Don't get complacent with growing expertise, right? So challenge yourself all the time.
Yeah, I think those are some great bits of advice, both for your younger self, but also anybody that's either listening to this podcast or maybe your adult children, that you can impart that 30 extra years of knowledge onto them. I think that's lovely. And I absolutely resonates with me that they're staying curious, or asking lots of questions. Any of my colleagues who or people that know me well know that I ask a lot of questions, but it helps me learn. So yeah, I think that's a really good one. Well, in that case, it brings us to the close of our episode. So thank you ever so much, Beat, for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and it just shows when they go fast, or they feel they go fast, then you're learning lots. So thank you ever so much for joining me. And that just leaves me to say that if you'd like to find out any more about either Impact, or if you'd like to connect with either myself or Beat on LinkedIn, then you'll find all of the links that you need in the description of where you found today's episode of our In Good Company podcast. So that it leaves me to just say thank you again to Beat for joining me today. Until the next time, take care. Hey, you're on my mind.